Today, we're going to dive into one of the most devastating industrial disasters in American history. This is the story of the Triangle Fire, and it's a tragedy that didn't just cost lives, it completely changed America's laws and really its soul. 146. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many people died on March 25th, 1911, and they were mostly young immigrant women and girls. So that brings us to the big question, the one we're going to unpack right now. How on earth did so many people die so unbelievably fast in a building that was supposed to be the model of modern safety? Well, the answer isn't just about the fire. It's about a whole system that was basically a ticking time bomb. Let's get into it. All right, first up, the tinderbox factory. Because to really understand the fire, you have to understand the place where it happened. This wasn't just some accident waiting to happen. You could almost say it was a disaster by design. This right here tells you everything you need to know about the gap between image and reality. On one hand, you've got the owners, Blank and Harris, called the Shirtwaist Kings. They look like these hugely successful innovators. Their factory? It's in this new, state-of-the-art, fireproof building. But inside, it was a nightmare, a total sweatshop. Machines were jammed so close together you could barely walk. Piles of flammable fabric scraps were everywhere. And here's the real kicker. They locked the exit doors to keep workers from taking breaks or stealing. So who were the people working in these horrible conditions? This gives you the human picture. It was a factory full of young women and girls, most of them recent Jewish and Italian immigrants. I mean, some were as young as 13. They'd come to America chasing a dream, right? But their vulnerability was just seen as a source of cheap labor for this booming industry. But here's something you have to know. These workers were not silent victims, not at all. Just a year before the fire, they staged a massive strike. It was a huge warning sign of the disaster that was just around the corner. And this is the moment it all kicked off. These are the words of Clara Lemlich, a 23-year-old worker at Triangle. She was fed up. She stood up in a huge meeting and basically lit a fire under everyone, sparking what became known as the Uprising of the 20,000. And what they were asking for was simple: decent pay, shorter hours, and basic safety improvements. They knew these factories were death traps. So what happened? Well, it was a bitter pill to swallow. A lot of the smaller factories gave in, but the Shirtwaist Kings, the owners of Triangle, they refused to budge on the really important stuff. They wouldn't recognize the union, and they wouldn't unlock the doors. So the workers went back, the doors stayed locked, and the stage was officially set for tragedy. Okay, now let's go to the day of the fire itself. You're about to see how all of this negligence boiled over into 18 minutes of absolute terror. Look at just how fast this all happened. At 4:40, a spark in a scrap bin. 5 minutes later, the bosses on the 10th floor get a phone call and they escape to the roof. But the workers on the 9th floor? Nothing. No warning. They only know something is wrong when the fire is literally coming up through the floor. They run for the main exit and it's locked. The other escape route, the fire escape, it just collapses under the weight. By the time the fire trucks get there, their ladders are too short. It's all over in less than 20 minutes. I mean, it wasn't just one thing that went wrong. It was everything. Every single safeguard failed. The main door was locked. Another door opened inward, so the crush of panicked people made it impossible to open. The fire hose inside was rotted out and useless. No alarms, no sprinklers. Every single way out was a dead end. 62. That's how many people were so trapped, with fire on one side and locked doors on the other, that they made the unimaginable choice to jump from the 9th floor. The fire was an absolute tragedy, but what happened next is what really turned the city's grief into pure, focused outrage. The city was heartbroken, and then it got angry, really angry. More than 100,000 people marched silently in the pouring rain. It was a funeral procession, but it was also a protest. It was the whole city shouting that this wasn't fate, this was greed. So you'd think, okay, now the owners will face justice. They were put on trial for manslaughter. The verdict came back in less than 2 hours. Not guilty. The defense lawyers had managed to convince the jury that the immigrant survivors were unreliable witnesses. For the public, this was just the final insult. If the courts wouldn't help, then the laws themselves had to be torn down and rewritten. And if you want to see just how twisted the system was, check this out. The owners collected a big insurance payout. It worked out to about $400 for every person who died. The families of the victims, after a civil suit, they were awarded $75. $75 for a human life.
It was just sickening.
But, and this is where the story turns, out of all that tragedy and injustice, a powerful reform movement rose up, one that would literally change the course of American history.
You know, the public was so furious that the politicians had no choice but to act. So New York created the Factory Investigating Commission. And this wasn't some committee that would just write a report and disappear. No, this group had real teeth. They had the power to go into any factory, to force owners to testify, and to completely rethink how government should protect its workers.
And here you see the fire's most direct legacy. It's incredible. You can draw a straight line from every single failure at the Triangle factory to a brand new law. Locked doors were outlawed. Fire escapes had to be stronger. Fire drills and sprinklers became mandatory. In just 3 years, they passed more than 30 new laws that created the strongest worker protection code in the entire country.
And the ripples didn't stop at New York's borders. And a lot of that is because of one person, Frances Perkins. She was a social worker who actually saw the fire happen from the street below. She later said that was the day the New Deal began. That moment drove her to become the commission's lead investigator. And years later, as FDR's Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever in a presidential cabinet, she baked the lessons of that fire right into America's national safety net.
The momentum just kept going. Senator Robert Wagner, another leader from that same commission, went on to write the famous Wagner Act. This was the law that finally gave workers the legal right to form a union and bargain together, the very same right the Triangle workers had fought and died for. So yeah, the Triangle Fire ignited a revolution in worker safety. The laws that came out of it are the foundation for protections that many of us take for granted today. But it does leave us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? More than a century later, have we really solved that basic conflict? That constant tension between a company's bottom line and the safety of its people? That's a question we're still wrestling with every single day.